The rain had turned the country road into a river of mud, and Emma Mitchell was losing the battle against both the storm and her own exhaustion. Each step forward seemed to slide her 2 steps back, her worn sneakers providing no grip against the slick earth that clung to her legs like desperate hands. In her left arm, 3-month-old Danny whimpered against the cold drops that found their way past the threadbare blanket she'd wrapped around him. In her right hand, a frayed rope led to the most unlikely traveling companion anyone had ever seen on these back roads of Montana. Patches, her goat, bleated miserably as she struggled to keep pace. The black and white Nubian had been Emma's salvation for the past 6 months, providing milk for Danny when there was no money for formula, and now she was their only remaining possession of any value. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Everything else had been sold, repossessed, or left behind in the hasty escape from the life that had crumbled around them like a house built on sand. Thunder rolled across the vast sky, and Emma squinted through the rain at what looked like a structure in the distance. "Please let it be shelter," she whispered to the wind, her voice barely audible over the storm. Dandy's cries were growing weaker, which frightened her more than if he'd been screaming. The baby needed warmth, dry clothes, and food, none of which she could provide while standing in this downpour miles from anywhere. The structure resolved itself into a ranch as she drew closer, and Emma's heart sank slightly. Ranch meant people, and people meant questions she wasn't ready to answer. But Danny's safety mattered more than her pride or her secrets. The main house sat low and sprawling, its log construction speaking of permanence and stability, things that felt foreign to Emma now. Smoke rose from the chimney, a gray ribbon against the darker gray of the storm clouds, promising warmth that called to her like a beacon. Emma hesitated at the gate, suddenly aware of how she must look. Mud coated her jeans up to the knees, her blonde hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and she was pretty sure she smelled like wet goat. This wasn't exactly the impression she'd wanted to make when asking for help, but desperation had a way of stripping away such concerns. The porch light flickered on as Emma approached, and she realized someone had been watching her struggle up the drive. The front door opened before she could even knock, revealing a tall man in his early 40s with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of sage. His dark brown hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and he wore the kind of clothes that spoke of practical work rather than fashion. Faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days but was clean and well-maintained. Marcus Kane had been watching the bedraggled figure approach for the better part of 10 minutes. Initially thinking it might be someone whose car had broken down in the storm. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to get stranded on the back roads, especially when the weather turned nasty. But as the figure drew closer, he'd realized with growing amazement that it was a young woman on foot, carrying what looked like a baby and leading what definitely looked like a goat. Now, standing in his doorway and getting his first clear look at her, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. She couldn't be more than 25 with cornflower blue eyes that held a desperate sort of courage and a stubborn set to her jaw that suggested she'd been fighting battles longer than someone her age should have to. The baby in her arms was clearly struggling, his tiny face red and pinched with cold and hunger. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the slow cadence of someone who'd learned that gentle words often accomplished more than urgent ones. "You look like you could use some help." Emma's carefully constructed composure cracked at the kindness in his tone. She'd expected suspicion, maybe even hostility. Instead, the stranger was looking at her with something that might have been compassion, and it nearly undid her completely. "I'm sorry to bother you," she managed, her voice hoarse from hours of walking in the cold rain. "My car broke down about 5 miles back, and I've been walking with my baby. I was hoping maybe I could use your phone to call for help." It was a lie, of course. There was no broken-down car, no roadside assistance that would come to rescue them. But the truth was too complicated, too dangerous to share with a stranger, no matter how kind his eyes seemed. The truth involved her ex-husband Derek, his mounting debts to very dangerous people, and the night 3 weeks ago when she'd grabbed Danny and run with nothing but the clothes on their backs and patches tied in the backyard. Marcus's gaze shifted to the goat, who was now trying to eat what appeared to be a decorative plant beside his porch steps. The animal looked as miserable as its human companions, her usually pristine coat muddy and matted. In all his years living on the ranch, Marcus had encountered many unexpected situations, but a woman with a baby and a goat showing up in a thunderstorm was definitely a first. "Phone's not working," he said, which was true. The storm had knocked out the landlines an hour ago, and cell service had always been spotty this far from town. But even if it had been working, something about this woman's story didn't quite add up. Her clothes, while muddy and soaked, were too nice to belong to someone whose car had simply broken down. The jeans were designer, the jacket was expensive, and her sneakers, despite their current bedraggled state, had cost more than most people spent on shoes. More telling was the way she held herself, the careful way she spoke, as if she was choosing each word deliberately. Marcus had learned to read people during his years as a paramedic in Billings, before he'd inherited the ranch and retreated to this quieter life. This woman was running from something, and whatever it was had her scared enough to be standing in his yard with a baby and a goat in the middle of a Montana thunderstorm. "Come inside," he said, stepping back and holding the door open wider. "You and the little one need to get warm and dry. We'll figure out the rest once you're not hypothermic." Emma hesitated, every instinct she'd developed over the past months screaming warnings about trusting strangers. But Danny chose that moment to let out a weak cry that sounded more like a whimper, and her maternal instincts overrode everything else. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping across the threshold into warmth that felt like salvation. The interior of the house was as welcoming as the exterior had promised. The living room was dominated by a stone fireplace where logs crackled and popped, sending dancing shadows across walls lined with bookshelves and family photographs. The furniture was comfortable and well used, the kind that invited people to sit and stay a while. Everything about the space spoke of a man who'd chosen comfort and functionality over style, and somehow that made Emma feel marginally safer. "What about your goat?" Marcus asked, glancing back toward the porch where Patches was now investigating the possibility of eating a wooden rocking chair. Emma flushed with embarrassment. "I know it's strange," she said quickly. "I can tie her up outside somewhere, maybe in your barn if you have one. She won't be any trouble." Marcus studied the animal through the rain-streaked window. The goat was clearly miserable and just as clearly devoted to the woman who'd brought her here. In all his years, he'd learned that animals were often better judges of character than humans, and this goat had clearly chosen her person. "Bring her in," he said, surprising himself with the words, "at least until the storm passes." Emma stared at him as if he'd suggested something impossible. "Inside the house? But she'll make a mess. She might chew on things." Marcus shrugged, moving toward the fireplace to add another log. "I've had worse house guests. Besides, she looks as cold and wet as you do." He turned back to Emma with something that might have been a smile. "Long as you don't climb on the roof, I reckon we can manage." The words hit Emma with unexpected force, not because they were particularly profound, but because they represented something she'd almost forgotten existed. Unconditional kindness from a stranger, simple human decency offered without expectation of return. She'd been running for so long, looking over her shoulder for so many weeks, that she'd begun to believe such things were myths. "You'd really let us stay?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, revealing more vulnerability than she'd meant to show. Marcus saw the fear that flickered behind her eyes, the way she unconsciously shifted Danny to put her body between the baby and the door, as if she was ready to run again at the first sign of threat. Whatever this woman was running from, it had hurt her badly enough to make simple kindness seem impossible to believe. "For tonight," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Storm's supposed to blow through by morning. We'll get you and the baby warm and fed, and tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." Emma felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when she'd made it this far. Instead, she nodded and went back out into the rain to collect Patches, who seemed delighted by the prospect of indoor accommodations and trotted into the house as if she'd been invited to tea at the governor's mansion. The goat immediately began exploring her new surroundings with the enthusiasm of a creature who'd spent too many nights sleeping rough. She sniffed at the furniture, investigated the corners, and seemed particularly interested in a potted plant that sat beside the fireplace. Marcus watched with amusement as Patches approached the plant with the careful concentration of a wine connoisseur examining a vintage bottle. "She's not going to eat that, is she?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was more curious than concerned. "Probably.
Emma admitted, feeling heat rising her cheeks. "She's not really a house goat. I mean, obviously. I'm sorry. This was a terrible idea. I should take her back outside." But Marcus was already moving the plant to a higher shelf, well out of Patch's reach. "Problem solved," he said, with the kind of practicality that comes from years of dealing with animals. "Now, let's get you both out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." He disappeared down a hallway and returned with an armload of clothes that looked like they'd swallow Emma whole. The sweatshirt was clearly his, navy blue with the faded logo of what might have been a college football team. The sweatpants were also oversized, but they were clean and dry, which made them more valuable than designer clothing as far as Emma was concerned. "Bathroom's down the hall. First door on the right," Marcus said, handing her the clothes along with a couple of towels that looked impossibly warm and soft.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Take your time. I'll see what I can rustle up for the little guy. Emma wanted to protest that she couldn't keep taking his kindness, that she had nothing to offer in return. But Danny chose that moment to let out another weak cry, and all her protests died in her throat. She hurried down the hallway to the bathroom, which turned out to be larger and more luxurious than she'd expected, with a deep bathtub and thick rugs that felt like heaven under her bare feet. She peeled off the wet clothes, grimacing at the mud and grime that had accumulated during their long walk. Danny's clothes were soaked through as well, his tiny body shivering despite the blanket she tried to keep wrapped around him. Emma ran warm water in the sink and used one of Marcus's towels to carefully clean and warm the baby, whispering soft reassurances that she hoped sounded more confident than she felt. When she emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, she found Marcus in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like heaven itself. He changed clothes as well, trading his wet flannel for a clean t-shirt that revealed arms corded with the kind of muscle that came from hard physical work rather than gym sessions. He looked up as she entered, and Emma saw his eyes widen slightly as he took in her appearance. Without the mud and wet hair, Emma Mitchell was striking in a way that probably caused her more trouble than it was worth. Her blonde hair, now clean and damp, caught the light from the kitchen fixtures, and the oversized clothes somehow managed to emphasize rather than hide her slender figure. But it was her eyes that held Marcus's attention, blue as a summer sky, but shadowed with experiences that someone her age shouldn't have had to endure. "Feeling better?" he asked, turning back to the stove before she could notice his scrutiny. "Much," Emma said, settling Danny more comfortably in her arms. He seemed warmer now, though still listless in a way that worried her. "What you've done for us tonight, I can't even begin to thank you." Marcus ladled soup into bowls, the rich aroma of beef and vegetables filling the kitchen. His movements were efficient but unhurried, speaking of someone comfortable in his own space. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a slight smile. "Wait until you taste my cooking. I'm better with animals than I am with people food." As if summoned by the mention of animals, Patches appeared in the kitchen doorway, having apparently completed her exploration of the living room. She looked around with bright, intelligent eyes, taking in the new territory with the same careful assessment she might have given a new pasture. Her attention fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made Emma slightly nervous. "I think she likes you," Emma said, watching as the goat approached Marcus with obvious interest. The goat considered him for a moment, then gently butted her head against his palm in what was clearly a gesture of approval. "Animals usually do," he said, scratching behind Patches' ears in a way that made the goat close her eyes in contentment. "People are more complicated." There was something in his tone that made Emma study his face more carefully. Marcus Kane had the look of a man who'd chosen solitude deliberately, who'd retreated from whatever complications people had brought to his life. She recognized the signs because she'd been running from her own complications for weeks now. They sat at his kitchen table to eat, and Emma was amazed by how normal it felt. The soup was excellent, despite Marcus's disclaimers, rich and warming in a way that seemed to reach down to her very bones. Danny had stopped fussing and was sleeping more peacefully than he had in days, perhaps sensing that they were finally somewhere safe, at least for the moment. Patches had settled near the back door, apparently content to wait and see what developed. She'd been surprisingly well-behaved since coming inside, limiting her exploration to sniffing and looking rather than the destructive investigation Emma had feared. It was as if the goat understood that this was their best chance for shelter and wasn't about to ruin it by eating the furniture. "So," Marcus said after they'd eaten in comfortable silence for several minutes, "what's your story? And before you give me another version about the broken-down car, you should know I've been living out here long enough to spot a story with holes in it." Emma felt her stomach clench despite the warmth of the soup. She'd known this moment would come, had been dreading it since she'd first knocked on his door. The truth was dangerous, not just for her, but potentially for anyone who got involved. But lies had a way of growing complicated, and she was too tired to maintain elaborate deceptions. "It's complicated," she said finally, meeting his eyes across the table. "Most things worth talking about are," Marcus replied. His voice was patient, without pressure, as if he was willing to wait as long as it took for her to find the words. Emma looked down at Danny, sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time in weeks. This man had shown them kindness when they desperately needed it, had opened his home to not just her and her baby, but to a goat, for heaven's sake. He deserved better than lies, even if the truth put him in danger. "I'm running from my ex-husband," she said quietly. "Derek Mitchell. He got involved with some very bad people, owed them money he couldn't pay. When they started making threats about me and Danny, I took the baby and left." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Emma saw something harden in his eyes. What kind of threats? The kind where they said they'd take Danny if Derek didn't pay up. Emma's voice caught slightly. They said a healthy baby would be worth more than the money Derek owed them, that there were people who'd pay good money for a child with no questions asked. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus set down his spoon with deliberate care, his movements controlled in a way that suggested he was keeping a tight rein on his temper. "How much does he owe?" $50,000. Emma laughed bitterly. "Might as well be 50 million for all the chance Derek has of paying it back. He's got a gambling problem, always has. I thought I could help him, thought if I just loved him enough, supported him enough, he'd get clean. Instead, he just kept digging the hole deeper." "And you've been on the run for how long?" 3 weeks. Emma shifted Danny to her other arm, careful not to wake him. "I've been staying in cheap motels, paying cash, trying to stay ahead of them. But the money's running out, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something beyond the kitchen window where the storm continued to rage. Emma could practically see him processing the information, weighing options, calculating risks. She'd told her story to exactly 3 people in the past 3 weeks. A motel clerk who'd helped her avoid a man asking questions, a gas station attendant who let her use the bathroom to change Danny's diaper, and now Marcus Kane. The first 2 had offered sympathy and small kindnesses. Marcus was the first to look like he was considering doing something about it. "These bad people," he said, finally turning his attention back to her. "What kind of bad are we talking about? Local troublemakers or something more serious?" "More serious." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "Derek borrowed from loan sharks connected to organized crime out of Vegas. The kind of people who don't make idle threats, who have resources and connections. They've been tracking us, getting closer each time I think I've found somewhere safe to stop." Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than frightened. Emma had expected fear, maybe concern about getting involved in something so dangerous. Instead, he looked like a man making calculations, assessing a problem that needed solving. "And the goat?" he asked, glancing over at Patches, who was now dozing near the back door. Emma couldn't help but smile, despite everything. "Patches belonged to the neighbor who was watching Danny while I worked. When I grabbed the baby and ran, she followed us out to the car. I couldn't just leave her behind, and she's been the only thing keeping Danny fed since we've been on the road. She produces enough milk for him, which meant I didn't have to buy formula or find stores or do anything that might leave a trail." "Smart thinking," Marcus said, and Emma heard genuine admiration in his voice. "You've been thinking like someone who knows how to survive, not just run." "I've had to learn fast." Emma looked down at Danny again, his small face peaceful in sleep.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd run away from problems instead of facing them. But when it comes to protecting him, I'll do whatever it takes. That's not running away, Marcus said firmly. That's fighting smart. There's a difference between courage and stupidity, and recognizing when you're outgunned is just good sense. The words hit Emma harder than she'd expected. For weeks, she'd been battling guilt about abandoning Derek, about not standing by her husband even when his choices put their child in danger. She'd been calling herself a coward, a quitter, someone who broke her vows at the first sign of real trouble. But Marcus was right. She hadn't run away from her problems. She'd run toward the only solution that kept Danny safe.
You help me run the ranch, raise the boy, build whatever kind of life we can make together. Marcus paused, his expression growing serious. I won't lie to you, Emma. It won't be easy. Ranch life is hard work, and this place is isolated. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town is 20 miles of rough road. If you're used to city conveniences, this will be a big adjustment. Emma almost laughed at that. After 3 weeks of sleeping in her car in cheap motels, running water and a roof that didn't leak sounded like luxury, and isolation didn't frighten her. In fact, it sounded like exactly what they needed. What about Patches? She asked, glancing over at the goat who had opened one eye at the sound of her name. Patches can stay, Marcus said without hesitation. Like I said before, long as she don't climb on the roof, we can make it work. Besides, if she's been keeping Danny fed, she's already earning her keep. Emma felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance in his voice. This man was offering to change his entire life for 2 strangers and a goat, asking for nothing in return except the chance to help them build something new. But there was still one more thing she needed to know. Why? She asked quietly. Really, why would you do this? There has to be more to it than just helping strangers in need. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. I used to be married, he said finally. My wife, Sarah, died 2 years ago. Cancer. We'd planned to have children, to fill this house with family, but the cancer came first. After she passed, I thought about selling the place, moving somewhere that didn't remind me of everything we'd planned and never got to have. He paused, looking around the kitchen as if seeing it through different eyes. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. This was her home, our home, and walking away felt like abandoning her memory. So I stayed. But I've been living like a ghost in my own house, just going through the motions without any real purpose. Emma felt her heart ache for this man who'd shown her such kindness. She could see the loneliness in him now, hidden beneath the practical competence, but there nonetheless. When I saw you walking up that road tonight, with your baby and your goat, fighting to protect what matters most to you, it reminded me what this place was supposed to be about. Family, purpose, something worth fighting for. Maybe helping you gives me back some of that purpose. The honesty in his words hit Emma like a physical blow. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have life tear away everything you'd planned for. And instead of letting that loss make him bitter or closed off, he was offering to open his home and his life to help someone else start over. You really mean it? She said, and it wasn't a question. I really mean it. Emma looked down at Danny, still sleeping peacefully in her arms, then over at Patches, who was watching the conversation with the patient attention of an animal who'd learned to trust her human's decisions. Finally, she looked back at Marcus Kane, this stranger who was offering them salvation in the form of a marriage certificate and a place to call home. Okay, she said quietly. Yes. If you're really sure about this, then yes. Marcus nodded, something that might have been relief crossing his features. Then we'd better start planning. The sooner Emma Mitchell becomes Emma Kane, the safer you and Danny will be. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to pass, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a gentle patter against the windows.
Emma felt as if the weather was reflecting the change in her own circumstances. The crisis that had brought her to Marcus's door was giving way to something that felt almost like hope. She had no idea what challenges lay ahead, what complications might arise from this unusual arrangement, or whether she and Marcus would be able to build any kind of real partnership together. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about running. Instead, she was thinking about staying, about building something new from the ashes of everything that had burned down behind her. Tomorrow she would have to start learning how to be Emma Kane instead of Emma Mitchell. Tomorrow she would have to figure out how to be a ranch wife, how to help run a working cattle operation, how to live in partnership with a man she barely knew. But tonight, for the first time in 3 weeks, she and Danny were safe. Tonight they were warm and dry and fed, surrounded by the kind of simple human kindness that she had begun to think was extinct in the world. And tomorrow, if all went according to plan, they would begin the process of disappearing completely, not by running away, but by becoming someone entirely new. The last thing Emma remembered before exhaustion finally claimed her was the sound of Patches settling more comfortably by the door, a contented sigh that seemed to say she approved of these new arrangements. Even the goat seemed to understand that they'd finally found what they'd been looking for all along, a place to stay. Judge Franklin Hayes had seen many unusual requests in his 30 years on the bench, but a rancher wanting to marry a young woman he'd known for exactly 4 days was definitely among the more memorable ones. The old man adjusted his glasses and looked across his desk at Marcus Kane, who sat with the calm patience that had always characterized him, and at the blonde woman beside him, who held a sleeping baby and looked like she might bolt from the room at any moment. "The circumstances are rather unusual, Marcus," the judge said carefully. His voice carried the measured tone of someone who'd learned to ask questions without seeming to pry. "Most couples I marry have known each other somewhat longer than a few days." Marcus met his old friend's gaze steadily. "Sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of long courtships. Emma and I have found we're compatible, and we'd like to make it official as soon as possible." Judge Hayes shifted his attention to Emma, noting the way she held herself, the careful control in her posture that spoke of someone trying very hard not to appear desperate. "And you, my dear, this is truly what you want?" Emma felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I know it seems sudden, but Marcus and I understand each other. We want to build a life together." It wasn't entirely a lie, Emma thought to herself. They did understand each other, at least in the ways that mattered. They both knew what loss felt like, what it meant to have life tear away your carefully laid plans, and they were both willing to take a leap of faith that this unusual arrangement might give them both something they needed. The judge studied them both for another long moment, then reached for the marriage license forms. "Well, Marcus, you've never been one for conventional approaches to anything. I suppose if this is what you both want, I can perform the ceremony this afternoon." Relief flooded through Emma so powerfully that she felt lightheaded. In a few hours, Emma Mitchell would cease to exist, and Emma Kane would take her place, a woman with a legal identity, a home, a husband who was willing to protect her and Danny from the dangers that had been pursuing them. Marcus had spent the morning making arrangements with the quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did. He opened a bank account in Emma's new name, contacted his lawyer to update his will to include her and Danny, and even stopped by the local department store to buy her a simple wedding dress. Nothing fancy, just a knee-length blue dress that brought out her eyes and made her feel less like a refugee and more like a woman preparing for her wedding day. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, conducted in Judge Hayes's chambers with his secretary and the court clerk serving as witnesses. Emma found herself focusing on Marcus's hands as he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the steadiness that had become her anchor in the chaos of the past few days. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus leaned forward and kissed her cheek with the gentle formality of someone sealing a business arrangement rather than expressing romantic love. It was exactly what they had agreed upon, but Emma was surprised by the small pang of something that might have been disappointment. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kane," the judge said with a warm smile. "May you find all the happiness you're looking for." Mrs. Kane. The name felt strange on her tongue, but also liberating. Emma Kane was a respectable, married woman living on a cattle ranch in Montana. Emma Kane had never been married to Derek Mitchell, had never fled in the night with a baby and a goat, had never spent 3 weeks looking over her shoulder for dangerous men with violent intentions. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both of them seeming to absorb the magnitude of what they'd just done. Danny slept peacefully in Emma's arms, unaware that his last name had just changed and his future had been fundamentally altered. In the back of Marcus's pickup truck, Patches rode with the patient dignity of a creature who'd learned to adapt to whatever circumstances life presented. "So, Marcus," he said as they turned onto the dirt road that led to the ranch, "I suppose we should talk about the practical arrangements."
How this is all going to work day to day. Emma nodded, grateful that he was approaching this like the business arrangement it was, rather than trying to pretend it was something more romantic than it actually was. What did you have in mind? Well, the ranch runs on a fairly regular schedule. Cattle need to be checked twice a day, fed in winter, moved between pastures in summer. There's always fence to be mended, equipment to be maintained, paperwork to be filed. I've been managing it alone, but 2 people could accomplish a lot more and have time left over for other things. Emma felt a flutter of nervousness. I should probably tell you, I don't know anything about cattle. I grew up in Las Vegas, worked in an office before Danny was born. My experience with animals pretty much begins and ends with Patches. Marcus glanced over at her with something that might have been amusement. Well, Patches is a good start. Goats and cattle aren't that different, really. Both of them are herd animals. Both of them respond to routine and consistency. The rest you can learn as we go. The confidence in his voice helped settle some of Emma's anxiety. She'd been worried that her complete ignorance of ranch life would make her more of a burden than a help. But Marcus seemed to view her lack of experience as simply another problem to be solved, rather than an insurmountable obstacle. "What about Danny?" she asked. "I mean, ranch work sounds like it requires a lot of time outdoors, and I can't exactly leave a baby unattended." "Well, we'll figure it out," Marcus said simply. "Babies are portable for the first few months, and there's plenty of work that can be done around the house and barn where you could keep an eye on him. As he gets older, kids and ranches go together pretty naturally. Lots of fresh air, room to run, animals to learn responsibility with." Emma tried to picture Danny as a toddler, then as a boy, growing up with the kind of freedom and stability she'd never had as a child. It was a beautiful vision, almost too good to allow herself to hope for. The ranch looked different in the afternoon sunlight than it had in the storm. Emma could see the rolling pastures stretching toward the mountains, dotted with cattle that looked like toys from this distance. The barn was larger than she'd realized, weathered but well-maintained, with a corral attached where several horses watched their approach with mild curiosity. "This is really beautiful," Emma said, meaning it. She'd grown up surrounded by concrete and neon, had never imagined that she might find peace in such wide-open spaces. Marcus parked the truck near the house and came around to help her down, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that surprised her. "Sarah loved this place," he said quietly. "Used to say it was like living inside a postcard, especially in the morning when the mist rises off the creek." Emma heard the pain in his voice and felt a sudden stab of guilt. She was stepping into the life that another woman had built, taking the place of someone who loved this man and this land and had been taken away too soon. It felt like a kind of theft, even though she knew Marcus had made the offer freely. "I don't want to replace her," Emma said impulsively. "I mean, I know that's not what this is about, but I want you to know that I understand this was her home first. I don't expect you to forget her or pretend she didn't exist." Marcus turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. "Thank you for saying that. But Emma, this isn't about replacement. Sarah's gone and nothing can change that. This is about building something new from what's left, giving this place purpose again instead of letting it become a monument to things that can't be changed." His words carried a finality that suggested he'd given this considerable thought, had wrestled with the ghosts of his past and come to terms with moving forward. Emma nodded, understanding that this was as much a leap of faith for him as it was for her, though for different reasons. They spent the rest of the afternoon touring the ranch, Marcus pointing out the various buildings and explaining their functions. The barn housed not just the horses, but also equipment, feed storage, and what would become Patches' new accommodations. There was a chicken coop that had been empty since Sarah's death, but could easily be restocked. a workshop where Marcus repaired equipment and built whatever custom solutions ranch life required, and a small guest house that had been used for seasonal workers in the past. The main house was larger than Emma had realized, with 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a living room dominated by the stone fireplace where she first warmed herself. The master bedroom was clearly Marcus's domain, with simple furniture and clothes that spoke of a man living alone. The room next to it had obviously been intended as a nursery, with pale yellow walls and a window that looked out over the pastures. "This can be Danny's room," Marcus said, opening the door wider so Emma could see inside. "Sarah and I had plans for it, but—" He paused, then continued with deliberate calm. "It should be used for what it was meant for." Emma felt tears threatening as she looked at the room that another woman had prepared with such hope, but instead of sadness, what she felt was gratitude that this space would finally fulfill its intended purpose, that Danny would grow up surrounded by the love that had gone into preparing it. The room across the hall would be Emma's, Marcus explained, showing her a comfortable space with its own bathroom and a window that caught the morning light. She'd been worried about the sleeping arrangements, unsure how to navigate the physical proximity that marriage implied, without the emotional intimacy that usually went with it. But Marcus had clearly thought it through, providing her with privacy and space while maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage. They were interrupted by the sound of Danny waking up, his cries echoing through the house with the urgency of a baby who'd slept through his usual feeding time. Emma hurried to tend to him, grateful for the familiar routine that helped settle her nerves about all the changes happening around them. Marcus found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, Danny contentedly nursing while she tried to figure out how to work the coffee maker one-handed. "Here, let me," he said, taking over the task with the easy competence of someone who'd been making his own coffee for years. Emma watched him move around the kitchen that was now technically hers as well, noting how he seemed to know exactly where everything was, how his movements were economical and sure. This was his space, his routine, his life that she was now stepping into. The magnitude of the adjustment they were both going to have to make hit her suddenly. "Second thoughts?" Marcus asked, apparently reading something in her expression as he handed her a coffee mug. Emma considered lying, offering reassurance that she was completely confident in their arrangement, but honesty had gotten us this far, and she sensed that their partnership would depend on continued truthfulness between them. Not second thoughts, exactly. More like reality setting in. This morning I was Emma Mitchell, a woman running from her past with no clear future. Tonight, I'm Emma Kane, married to a man I barely know, living in a house that belongs to someone else's memories, responsible for helping run a business I know nothing about. It's a lot to process. Marcus settled into the chair across from her, his own coffee mug cradled in hands that bore the permanent stains of outdoor work. "You're right, it is a lot. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't having my own moments of wondering what the hell I've gotten myself into." Emma felt a flutter of panic. "Are you regretting it already?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "But I'd be foolish not to acknowledge that we're both taking a huge risk. We're essentially strangers who've agreed to share a life based on a few hours of conversation and mutual desperation. There's no guarantee we'll be compatible in the long term, no way to know if this arrangement will work out the way we're hoping." Emma appreciated his honesty, even as it made her more nervous. "So what do we do if it doesn't work out?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I suppose we deal with that if and when it happens. But Emma, I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work. Not just the marriage on paper, but the partnership we talked about. I'm not going to throw in the towel at the first sign of difficulty." His words helped calm some of Emma's anxiety. She'd been so focused on escaping Derek and his creditors that she hadn't fully considered what came after safety was secured. Now she was beginning to understand that the hard work was just beginning. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said, shifting Danny to his shoulder for burping. "What made you so sure about this? I mean, you're taking in a complete stranger and her baby, changing your entire life for people you'd known for less than a day. Most people would think that's crazy." Marcus smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "Most people would probably be right. But I've learned that the most important decisions in life usually feel a little crazy when you're making them. When I decided to leave my job in Billings and take over this ranch, everyone thought I was having some kind of breakdown. When Sarah and I got married after knowing each other for only 3 months, her parents were convinced I was either a fortune hunter or mentally unstable." Emma found herself curious about his past, about the life he'd lived before becoming the isolated rancher who'd rescued her from the storm. "What did you do in Billings?" "I was a paramedic. Spent 8 years running emergency calls, seeing people on the worst days of their lives. It's the kind of job that either breaks you or teaches you what really matters." "So what's your plan?" Marcus asked. "You can't keep running forever, not with a baby. Eventually, the money runs out, or you get tired, or you make a mistake, and they catch up." "I don't have a plan," Emma admitted, the words painful to say aloud. "I've been taking it one day at a time, trying to stay ahead of them long enough to figure out what to do next. I thought maybe if I could get far enough away, find somewhere remote enough, I could disappear until Derek either pays what he owes or they lose interest in us." Marcus shook his head. "People like that don't lose interest. They can't afford to, or everyone they loan money to will think they can just walk away without consequences. They'll keep looking until they find you, no matter how far you run." Emma felt despair settling over her like a cold blanket. She'd known it was true, had known that running could only be a temporary solution, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly by someone else made it feel final. "So what am I supposed to do? Go back? Let them take Danny because his father can't control himself?" "No," Marcus said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised her. "But running isn't working either. Sometimes the only way to stop being hunted is to change the game entirely." "What do you mean?" Marcus stood up, moving to the window where he could see out into the storm. The rain was beginning to slacken, the lightning still flickered in the distance. "You said these people are from Vegas, connected to organized crime. That means they're probably not looking for a young mother with a baby living on a ranch in the middle of Montana. They're looking for Emma Mitchell, the woman who ran away with her husband's debt hanging over her head." Emma stared at him, not understanding where he was going with this. But what if Emma Mitchell disappeared? Marcus turned back to face her, his expression serious but determined. "What if instead of running from who you are, you became someone else entirely?" "You're talking about fake identities? New names?" Emma shook her head. "That kind of thing costs money I don't have, and even if I could afford it, how would I know who to trust? For all I know, the people offering to help would just turn me over to Derek's creditors for the reward money." Marcus was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. Finally, he spoke, his voice careful and measured. "What if I told you there might be another way, something that didn't involve fake documents or trusting strangers with your life?" Emma felt a flicker of hope, dangerous and painful. What kind of other way? "Marriage." The word hung in the air between them like a bridge Emma wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. She stared at Marcus, trying to process what he'd just suggested. "Marriage?" she repeated, certain she must have misunderstood. "Think about it," Marcus said, sitting back down at the table. "You marry me, you become Emma Kane, legally, completely, with all the documentation anyone could want. Emma Mitchell disappears because she no longer exists. And a married woman living on a working ranch in Montana with her husband and child isn't the kind of person loan sharks from Vegas are looking for." Emma's mind reeled. It was crazy, impossible, the kind of thing that only happened in movies or romance novels. But even as she tried to dismiss it, she could see the logic in what he was suggesting. A new name, a new identity, but one that was completely legal and legitimate. No forged documents, no criminal connections, no risk of being discovered and prosecuted for fraud. "But you don't even know me," she protested. "Why would you do something like that for a complete stranger?" Marcus considered the question, his gaze drifting to Danny and then to Patches, who was still sleeping peacefully by the door. "Because sometimes life puts people in your path when you both need something the other can provide. You need safety and a new identity. I need—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I need a reason to remember why this place matters." Em sensed there was a story behind those words, something that explained why a man who clearly had his life together was living alone on a remote ranch in Montana, but she didn't push. Instead, she focused on the practical aspects of what he was suggesting. "But a marriage of convenience? That's not, you'd expect—" She struggled with how to phrase the question delicately. Marcus held up a hand, stopping her. "This would be a business arrangement, pure and simple. You'd have your own room, your own space. The marriage would be real in the eyes of the law, but it would be whatever we agreed it should be, between us. No expectations, no pressure, just two people helping each other solve a problem." Emma looked down at Danny, still sleeping peacefully in her arms. The idea was tempting in a way that scared her. Safety, security,
a chance for her son to grow up without looking over his shoulder. But it also felt like accepting charity on a scale that she could never hope to repay. "I don't have anything to offer you in return," she said quietly. "No money, no skills that would be useful on a ranch. I'd just be another mouth to feed, another responsibility you don't need." Marcus smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from him since he'd arrived. "You'd be surprised what you might have to offer. This place has been pretty quiet since I've been running it alone. Could use someone with fresh eyes, fresh ideas. And Danny there, he's going to need a stable place to grow up. Kids change a place, make it feel more like a home instead of just a house. But what if Derek finds us? What if his creditors track us down somehow? I won't be responsible for bringing danger to your door." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," Marcus said simply. "Besides, I'm not exactly helpless if trouble comes calling. I've dealt with difficult situations before." There was something in his tone that suggested he was speaking from experience, that Marcus Kane wasn't just a rancher who'd lived a quiet life in the Montana wilderness. Emma filed that information away for later consideration. "This is crazy," she said, but even as she spoke the words, she could feel herself wavering. The idea of safety, of a place where Danny could sleep without her having to listen for footsteps in the hallway, was almost too tempting to resist. "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but sometimes crazy is the only thing that works. You said yourself that you can't keep running forever. This way, you stop running and start living again." Emma thought about the past 3 weeks, the constant fear, the cheap motels, the knowledge that every day brought Derek's creditors closer to finding them. She thought about Danny growing up always looking over his shoulder, never having a real home, never being able to make friends or go to school without wondering if today would be the day they'd have to run again. And then she thought about what Marcus was offering: a home, safety, a chance for her son to have a normal childhood. It would mean trusting a stranger with their lives, betting everything on the kindness of a man she'd known less than 4 hours. But what was the alternative? "If I said yes," she said slowly, "when would how would this work practically?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We'd need to get married as soon as possible, before anyone has a chance to connect Emma Mitchell with Emma Kane. There's a judge in town who's a friend of mine, someone discreet who wouldn't ask too many questions about the hurry. We could probably get it done within a few days." A few days. Emma felt her heart racing at the thought. In less than a week, she could go from being a fugitive to being a married woman with a legal identity that no one from her past could touch. "And after that, you and Danny live here as my wife and stepson."
For me, it was the latter. That explains something about him, Emma thought. The calm competence in crisis situations, the ability to assess problems quickly and take decisive action, the lack of panic when faced with her unusual circumstances. He'd spent years making split-second decisions that affected whether people lived or died. "Is that how you knew so much about Danny's needs? The feeding schedule? The way you helped me get him settled that first night?" Marcus nodded. "Emergency medicine includes a lot of pediatric calls. Sick babies, accidents, family crises. You learn to read the signs, to know when a situation is serious and when it just looks scary." Emma felt another wave of gratitude for the man who'd taken them in. Not only had he offered them safety, but he'd done so with the knowledge and experience to actually help, rather than just good intentions. "What about you?" Marcus asked. "What did you do before Derek, before all this?" Emma shifted uncomfortably, still not entirely used to talking about her past, without worrying about who might be listening. "I worked in customer service for a hotel chain, nothing glamorous. Handled reservations, complaints, special requests. It was steady work, with decent benefits, which mattered more than excitement." She paused, remembering the woman she'd been before Derek's gambling had turned their lives upside down. "I actually liked it," she continued. "I was good with people, good at solving problems and making things work out. I thought maybe I'd work my way up to management eventually, maybe even hotel administration. I had plans." "Those plans got derailed when you met Derek?" Marcus asked gently. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. Derek was charming, confident, the kind of man who made big promises and seemed like he could deliver on them. He had plans too, talked about starting his own business, making it big in real estate. I thought we were building something together. What went wrong? The gambling started small,
just weekend trips to the casinos with friends. But Derek had one of those personalities that doesn't do anything halfway. When he won, he'd come home talking about quitting his job and playing poker professionally. When he lost, he'd borrow money to try to win it back. Emma felt the familiar ache of disappointment and betrayal. I kept thinking I could save him, that if I just loved him enough, supported him enough, he'd see what he was throwing away. Instead, I just enabled him to dig the hole deeper. Marcus reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. It's not your fault that he made bad choices, Emma. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. The simple kindness in his touch and his words nearly undid her. For so long, she'd been carrying the weight of Derek's failures as if they were her own, as if she should have been able to prevent the spiral that led to their current situation. Danny finished his feeding and settled into the drowsy contentment that usually preceded his afternoon nap. Emma found herself reluctant to put him down, partly because holding him helped calm her own nerves, and partly because she wasn't sure where his things should go in this house that was now theirs. "You know," Marcus said, apparently reading her uncertainty, "we should probably go shopping tomorrow. Get some baby supplies, clothes for you, whatever you need to make this feel more like home." Emma felt a flush of embarrassment. "I don't have much money left," she admitted. "Enough for a few necessities, but not enough for a real shopping trip." Marcus waved away her concern. "Emma, you're my wife now. What's mine is yours, and that includes the bank account. We're partners in this, which means we share the responsibilities and the resources." The matter-of-fact way he said it made Emma's throat tight with emotion. After months of careful budgeting and constant worry about money, the idea of financial security felt almost too good to be true. "I'll pay you back," she said, "once I figure out how to contribute to the ranch, once I'm earning my keep somehow." Marcus shook his head. "This isn't about keeping score, Emma. This is about building a life together. And that means we both invest what we have and share what we get out of it." Emma nodded, though she privately resolved to find ways to contribute that went beyond just accepting his generosity. She'd been taking care of herself for too long to be completely comfortable with dependence, even the kind that came with marriage. They were interrupted by a knock at the front door, sharp and authoritative, in a way that made Emma's blood run cold. She and Marcus looked at each other, both of them instantly alert. "Expecting anyone?" Emma whispered, her heart already racing with the familiar panic that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. Marcus shook his head, moving toward the window to see who was outside. His expression grew grim as he peered through the curtains. Sheriff's deputy, and he's not alone. Emma felt the world tilt around her. They'd found her. Somehow, despite all their precautions, Derek's creditors had tracked her down. She started to stand, already planning their escape route, but Marcus caught her arm. "Easy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're Emma Kane now, remember? You have every right to be here, and no reason to run." The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Kane, Deputy Collins, need to have a word with you." Marcus squeezed Emma's shoulder once, a gesture of reassurance, then walked to the front door. Emma remained in the kitchen, Danny clutched against her chest, straining to hear the conversation that would determine whether their new life was over before it had truly begun. "Afternoon, Deputy," Marcus said, opening the door but not inviting the men inside. "What can I do for you?" "We're looking for a woman," the deputy said, his voice carrying clearly through the house. "Emma Mitchell, age 24, blonde hair, blue eyes, traveling with an infant and possibly a goat. Her husband filed a missing persons report. Says she took off with the baby and some valuable property." Emma's stomach clenched. Derek had reported her as a kidnapper, making her the criminal instead of the victim. It was exactly the kind of manipulation he excelled at, twisting the truth until he came out looking like the injured party. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," Marcus replied, his tone conversational but cautious. "This is pretty isolated country. Most folks who come through here are just passing by on the main road." "Mind if we take a look around?" the deputy asked, just to be thorough. Emma held her breath, waiting for Marcus to refuse, to demand a warrant, to do something that would protect her from discovery. Instead, she heard him step back from the door. "Sure thing," Marcus said. "Though I should mention, my wife's inside with our baby. She's still getting settled after our wedding yesterday, so I'd appreciate it if you could keep things low-key." Emma stared at the kitchen doorway in amazement.
Marcus was not only allowing the search, but he was claiming her as his wife openly and without hesitation. The marriage certificate in her purse felt like the most valuable document in the world. "Congratulations," the deputy said, and she could hear genuine warmth in his voice. "Didn't know you gotten married, Marcus." "Bit of a whirlwind romance. Marcus and I met a few months ago when she was visiting friends in town."
Things moved pretty fast after that. Emma marveled at how smoothly he lied, creating a plausible backstory without a moment's hesitation. It was exactly the kind of quick thinking that had made him successful as a paramedic, she realized. She heard footsteps entering the house, multiple sets moving through the room she'd toured just hours earlier. Her heart hammered as the sounds grew closer to the kitchen. "Emma," Marcus called, his voice carrying a note of warning. "The deputy here is looking for someone. Mind coming out so he can see you're not who they're looking for?" Emma took a deep breath and walked into the living room, Danny still in her arms. The deputy was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that didn't seem immediately threatening. Behind him stood another man in civilian clothes who had the look of someone accustomed to asking hard questions. "This is my wife, Emma Kane," Marcus said, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture that looked natural and protective. "Emma, this is Deputy Collins," and he nodded toward the second man. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name?" "Johnson," the second man said, his eyes studying Emma with uncomfortable intensity. "I'm a private investigator hired by Mr. Mitchell to locate his missing wife and child." Emma felt her knees go weak, but Marcus's arm tightened around her, lending her strength. She forced herself to meet Johnson's gaze directly, drawing on every acting skill she'd never known she possessed. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I don't know anyone named Mitchell. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Johnson continued to study her, clearly comparing her appearance to whatever description Derek had provided. "The woman we're looking for is about your height and coloring, traveling with a baby about the same age as yours." Emma managed what she hoped was a sympathetic smile. "That's terrible. A missing mother and baby? I hope you find them safely." "There was also mention of a goat," Deputy Collins added, almost apologetically. "I know it sounds strange, but apparently the animal was taken along with the woman and child." From outside came a familiar bleat, as if Patches had been summoned by the mention of her species. Emma's heart stopped, but Marcus didn't even blink. "That would be our goat," he said matter-of-factly. "Emma insisted on bringing her when she moved in. City girl trying to adjust to ranch life, you know how it is." Johnson's eyes sharpened. "Mind if we take a look at this goat?" Marcus shrugged. "Sure, though I'm not sure what you're expecting to find. A goat's a goat." They walked outside together, Emma fighting the urge to run with every step. Patches was in the corral, contentedly munching on hay and looking like she'd lived there her entire life. Johnson studied the animal carefully, but there was nothing distinctive about her that would mark her as stolen property rather than just another ranch goat. "Looks like a standard Nubian," Johnson said, finally, disappointment clear in his voice. "That's what the seller told us," Marcus agreed. "Good milk production, good temperament with kids. Emma thought it would be educational for the baby as he grows up." Emma marveled at how naturally Marcus spun their story, weaving truth and fiction together in a way that was impossible to challenge. They were looking for a woman running with a stolen goat, but what they'd found was a married couple with a legitimately owned farm animal. The search continued for another 20 minutes, with Johnson and Deputy Collins checking the barn, the outbuildings, and even the guest house. Emma followed along, playing the role of the cooperative ranch wife while her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. Finally, apparently satisfied that Emma Mitchell was not hidden anywhere on the property, the two men prepared to leave. "Sorry to bother you folks," Deputy Collins said, tipping his hat to Emma. "Hope you understand we had to follow up on the report." "Of course," Emma replied. "I hope you find whoever you're looking for." Johnson handed Marcus a business card. "If you do happen to see anything suspicious, anyone asking questions or seeming out of place, I'd appreciate a call. Mr. Mitchell is very concerned about his wife and child." "Absolutely," Marcus said, pocketing the card. "We'll keep our eyes open." After the men left, Emma and Marcus stood in the yard watching their dust trail disappear toward the main road. Emma felt like she might collapse from the adrenaline crash, but Marcus remained calm and alert. "They bought it," Emma said, finally, hardly daring to believe it. "For now," Marcus agreed, "but they'll be back, or others like them will. We need to be prepared for more visits, more questions." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What if they don't give up? What if Derek keeps sending people until someone figures out who I really am?
Marcus turned to face her, his expression serious but determined. "Then we'll deal with each situation as it comes. But Emma, you need to understand something. As far as the law is concerned, you are Emma Kane. You have a marriage certificate, a legal identity, every right to be here. Derek Mitchell can send all the private investigators he wants, but they can't take you anywhere you don't want to go." His words helped settle some of Emma's panic, but she could see the complications stretching ahead of them. A life spent looking over their shoulders, always wondering when the next knock would come at the door. "What about Danny?" she asked. "Even if they can't touch me legally, Derek is still his biological father. Couldn't he claim parental rights?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the legal implications. "That's something we'll need to talk to a lawyer about. But in the meantime, Danny's safe here, and we'll make sure he stays that way." Emma nodded, trying to draw strength from Marcus's confidence, even as her mind raced with all the ways their carefully constructed new life could still fall apart. As if sensing her distress, Danny began to fuss, his small cries drawing Emma's attention back to the immediate needs of caring for him. She looked down at her son, this tiny person who depended completely on her, and felt her resolve solidify. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever threats Derek and his associates might pose, she would face them. Emma Kane was not the same woman who'd fled in the night 3 weeks ago. Emma Kane had a home, a husband, and a law on her side. The evening that followed was surreal in its normalcy. Marcus cooked dinner while Emma fed Danny and got him settled for the night. They ate together at the kitchen table, talking about ranch schedules and practical arrangements, as if they'd been married for years rather than hours. The ordinary domesticity of it felt both comforting and strange after weeks of uncertainty. Later, as Emma settled into her new bedroom, with Danny sleeping peacefully in the nursery next door, she reflected on the extraordinary day that had transformed her from a fugitive to a wife. The marriage certificate lay on her dresser, official and real, proof that Emma Kane existed and had every right to the safety she'd found. Outside her window, she could see the barn where Patches was settling into her new accommodations, probably wondering how she'd gotten so lucky as to trade a life on the run for warm shelter and regular meals. Emma understood exactly how the goat felt. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, and undoubtedly more questions about who they were and how they'd come to be together. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Emma Kane was sleeping in her own bed, in her own home, with her husband nearby and her son safe. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen. And despite all the uncertainties that lay ahead, that felt like victory enough for now. 6 months later, Emma Kane stood in the morning sunlight, watching her husband gentle a skittish colt, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had grown cold while she'd been lost in thought. Danny gurgled happily from his carrier strapped to her chest, his chubby hands reaching for the autumn leaves that danced in the crisp October air. The baby had grown strong and healthy on ranch life, his cheeks rosy from mountain air and his disposition sunny as a child who'd never known uncertainty. The transformation in all their lives had been remarkable. Emma had discovered an aptitude for ranch work that surprised everyone, including herself. Her organizational skills from her hotel days translated perfectly to managing feed schedules, veterinary records, and the 1,000 small details that kept a working ranch functioning smoothly. Marcus had taught her to ride, to read weather patterns, to spot signs of illness in cattle before problems became serious. She'd learned to repair fence, assist with births, and handle the business side of their operation with growing confidence. But perhaps the most unexpected change had been in their relationship. What had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers had evolved into something deeper, more genuine.
They developed an easy partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Marcus had proven to be patient, kind, and surprisingly funny when he let his guard down. Emma had found herself looking forward to their conversations over morning coffee, to working alongside him during the day, to the comfortable domesticity of their evening routines. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke through her contemplation. Emma's stomach tightened reflexively, the old fear never completely gone despite months of peaceful living. But as the truck came into view, she recognized the familiar figure of Deputy Collins behind the wheel. His visits had become routine over the past months, partly official business and partly social calls, as he'd grown to consider Marcus and Emma friends rather than just residents in his jurisdiction. "Morning, Emma," the deputy called, stepping out of his patrol car with a grin. "How's that boy yours doing?" "Growing like a weed," Emma replied, genuinely glad to see him. Danny twisted in his carrier, recognizing the deputy's voice and breaking into one of his spectacular baby smiles. Collins had been charmed by Danny from their first meeting, and the baby seemed to sense a friend. Marcus appeared from the corral, wiping his hands on a rag and looking pleased to see their visitor. "Frank, good to see you. Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Don't mind if I do," Collins said, following them toward the house. "Actually, I've got some news you might be interested in." Emma felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. Over the months, she'd learned to manage the anxiety that came with any mention of news from the outside world. Good news or bad news? Collins accepted a mug of coffee and settled into his usual chair at their kitchen table. "Depends on your perspective, I suppose. That private investigator, Johnson, the one who was looking for the missing woman, he's called off the search." Emma's heart stopped for a moment before resuming at double speed. "Called it off? Why?" "Seems the husband, Derek Mitchell, got himself arrested in Las Vegas 3 weeks ago." Collins stirred sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness. "Attempted robbery of a casino cage, if you can believe that. Apparently, he was desperate enough to try stealing from the people he owed money to." Emma sank into a chair, Danny still strapped to her chest. She felt Marcus's hand settle on her shoulder, steady and reassuring. "What happened to him?" 20 years minimum, Collins continued. "Nevada doesn't take kindly to armed robbery, especially when it involves casinos. Word is he cut a deal with the feds, gave up information about his loan shark connections in exchange for protective custody." Emma stared at the deputy, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "It's over? He can't send anyone else looking for us?" "Well," Collins said carefully, "there's still the matter of the missing persons report. Technically, you're still listed as kidnapped, along with your baby and that goat of yours." Emma felt the blood drain from her face, but Collins held up a reassuring hand. "However," he continued with a slight smile, "missing persons cases get closed all the time when people turn up safe and sound, living their own lives by choice. If someone were to contact the Las Vegas police and explain that Emma Mitchell had simply left her husband and started a new life, well, that would pretty much wrap things up." "But wouldn't that expose Emma's location?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. Collins shrugged. "Only if Emma Mitchell still existed. But if someone called and said that Emma Mitchell had remarried and was now living under her legal married name in Montana, well, there wouldn't be much point in maintaining an active missing persons case, would there?" Emma looked between the two men, seeing the careful way they were discussing her situation, the layers of meaning in their seemingly casual conversation. "You're saying I should call the police and tell them Emma Mitchell is safe?" "I'm saying a call from someone confirming that a missing person is alive and well, living under their legal married name, would probably close the file permanently," Collins said, "especially if that person could provide documentation proving the marriage was legitimate." Emma felt tears threatening as the full implication hit her. After months of looking over her shoulder, of jumping at unexpected visitors, of worrying that their carefully constructed life might crumble at any moment, she was being offered genuine freedom. "There's just one thing," Collins added, his expression growing more serious. "This would mean Emma Mitchell officially disappears forever. Once that file is closed, there's no going back. You'd be Emma Kane permanently, in every legal sense." Emma looked at Marcus, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. Over the past months, being Emma Kane had stopped feeling like a role she was playing and started feeling like who she really was. Emma Mitchell belonged to a painful past, a life built on lies and broken promises. Emma Kane had a home, a husband who cared for her, a son who was thriving, and a future full of possibilities. "I think," Emma said slowly, "that Emma Mitchell made her choice the night she walked away from Derek. Everything since then has just been Emma Kane figuring out how to live her best life." Collins nodded approvingly. "Smart woman. I'll let you know how to handle the call to make sure everything goes smoothly." After the deputy left, Emma and Marcus sat in their kitchen, the magnitude of this development settling over them like morning sunshine. The threat that had shadowed their entire relationship was finally truly over. "You know what this means," Marcus said quietly. Emma shook her head, almost afraid to voice what she was thinking. "It means we can stop pretending this is just a practical arrangement," Marcus continued. "It means we can be whatever we want to be to each other, without any external pressure or artificial timeline." Emma felt her heart flutter with something that might have been hope. "What do you want us to be?" Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "I want us to be a real family, Emma. Not just on paper, not just for convenience, but because we choose each other every day." Emma felt tears spill over, months of carefully controlled emotions finally finding release. "I want that too," Emma whispered. "I've wanted it for longer than I was brave enough to admit." Marcus stood and moved around the table, drawing her up into his arms. Danny, caught between them, gurgled his approval of this new arrangement. When Marcus kissed her, really kissed her for the first time, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known she was looking for. That evening they made the phone call together, Emma's voice steady as she explained to the Las Vegas police that Emma Mitchell was safe, happily remarried and living under her legal married name in Montana. The detective who took the call was professional and thorough, asking just enough questions to satisfy the legal requirements before closing the file permanently. When Emma hung up the phone, Marcus pulled her close again. "How does it feel to be free?" Emma looked around a kitchen where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many quiet moments of building a life together. Through the window, she could see Patches grazing contentedly in the pasture, looking like she'd never lived anywhere else. From the nursery came the soft sounds of Danny's peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that he was home. "It feels like the beginning," Emma said, meaning every word. Later that night, as autumn stars wheeled overhead and the mountain air carried the scent of coming winter, Emma Kane fell asleep in her husband's arms, her son sleeping safely in the next room, and her goat keeping watch in the barn below. She'd arrived at this ranch, muddy and desperate, carrying a baby and leading a goat, running from a life that had crumbled around her. She'd found something immeasurably better than what she'd lost. She'd found a home where love grew quietly in the space between morning chores and evening conversations, where safety meant more than just the absence of danger, where family was built not just on blood, but on choice, commitment, and the daily decision to show up for each other. The woman who'd knocked on Marcus Kane's door 6 months ago had been looking for shelter from a storm. The woman who slept in his arms tonight had found something much more precious. She had found herself, and in doing so, had found her way home. As Marcus had said that first night, as long as she didn't climb on the roof, they could make it work. And they had made it work in ways that none of them could have imagined when a desperate woman, a baby, and a goat had first appeared on his doorstep through the rain.